Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, and this is a show where we sit around, we talk about gaming, we talk about things that inspire us, things that are beautiful, things that we love. John Doom, I had Billy Joe's coffee yesterday. Evan, good friend of the show, fellow co-host of Exploring Clorantha, was in town yesterday, and I was able to meet him for coffee. You just need to come back out, John, because his coffee is the best. He now has a monthly He's going to do a monthly drink called FOMO. It'll be available for 1 month and then gone. So he can experiment with new drinks and see what sticks. Which is pretty cool. So, welcome to the show today. Good morning to John and Tink. Good to see you both. We're going to be talking about prepping a story. And I know I may have already stepped in it. Some of you may be already going, JM, I don't like stories. I don't play story games. I'm here for the sandbox. And don't worry, I've got you covered. Other of you may be saying, that's all I will run. I love running stories. I want to plot the whole thing out, start to finish. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the pitfalls, what I like to do when I'm planning a campaign. But let's define some terms. First of all, there is a spectrum, if you will, of games, and those games are. Hold on, I'm going to pull this up here. I want to see what Savage Secret World is up to. Secret World for Savage World. We're going to have them on the Savage Universe show tonight at I want to say it's like 10 Eastern. So then subtract 1 hour from Eastern. They're at 20,000. They're almost at $21,000 2 days in. I am partial to you guys supporting them because the first stretch goal at 25,000 is an adventure written by yours truly. So if we can get them there, I would be super excited about that. But so let's define some terms. On one end of the spectrum, you have what we call the sandbox. And the sandbox is, or I would also call it maybe the modular episodic campaign, where the GM doesn't prep a through story. They don't prep a first, second, and third act. They don't prep a 5-act structure. They prep a little setting and sprinkle it with individual adventures, trusting the players to kind of thread their story together. And I love this, and I think there's something that we all need to learn from sandbox style play, and that's the idea of emergent story. So many of us, GMs and players alike, come to the table with the story already written in our head. We come with a 5-page background on our character. Here's everyone they know, and here's how they react in all situations, and here's the tragic story that I'm going to want to see played out. GMs can do that too. GMs can be like, here is my massive 5-arc story that we're going to tell together, but this is the story we're going to follow. And in both cases, I think both can negate player agency, which, if you follow the channel at all, is my gold standard. It's my North Star. It's my guiding light. I always want the players, of which I am one, to have the agency to make choices that matter and change the world. So in the sandbox play, the idea is when you come to the table, that's when the story starts. The story is the narrative that emerges from all of these seemingly disconnected events that we at the end of the campaign can look back and see the arc of the story. It allows players to pick up the threads that they like and leave behind the ones they don't. Inevitably, those NPCs they hate become bigger enemies, and those that they love become friends and boon companions. The agency being different, yes, from player agency. The TPA should not be confused with any TLAs. So the player agency should not be confused with 3-letter agencies. I mean, maybe if you're talking about factions, but we're not going to get into that. On the other side, we have what I'm going to call a narrative play, where the GM comes down and they say, hey, here's the story we're going to run. It's whether it's a pre-made adventure that's designed to take you from 1 to 15 or 20, if you're running a Pathfinder adventure path or a Wizards of the Coast pre-made adventure, or some of the great ones that are over on Drive-Thru RPG. This really sort of is the idea that the GM has plotted out over 3, 5, or 6 acts, kind of the narrative of the story. And for new GMs, these are super helpful. Like, we can sit down, we can just prep what we need, and we can move on. What's great about these is that they give us a lot of narrative coherency early on. The players aren't like, well, what do we do now? Hey, how do these two things relate? In general, those tend to be much more cohesive from the start. It allows all of these little subplots to interact in a wonderful and unique way, and really allows the table to experience the grand sweep of a story from someone else's mind. However, both players and the GM can get stuck on, well, if it's not part of this through line, I don't want anything to do with it. And in some ways, it may encourage us to go, well, I really need to get them from point A to point B, and they want to go do X, so I need to stop X and pull them back into Y, or pull them back towards B. And that's not great, because again, you're curtailing agency. I think the best examples, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a ton of great adventure paths. Rise of the Runelords comes to mind. Kingmaker. Wrath of the Righteous. I've played through all of these. Princes of the Apocalypse. Storm King's Thunder. Curse of Strahd. If I'm looking over on my shelf from 2nd edition, they were much smaller campaigns, but you have things like Dragon Mountain, Night Below, Rod of 7 Parts. All of these are sort of modular, long-term campaigns. Now, what I think is the gold standard for modern adventure path narrative campaigns are the Savage Worlds plot point campaigns. They break up the campaign into very discrete chunks that tend to have an order to follow, but they're so lightweight and sketched out that making massive adjustments to a plot point campaign is very easy. It's also very easy to put in a ton of modules or other smaller adventures in between the large chunks of the plot point campaign, such as a Savage Tale, or an adventure that focuses in on 1 or 2 of your players because, and you thought that death worshipping Greek-inspired elves was a great way to tie in your elven shifter and your demigod daughter of Hades. It gives you the ability to follow through an interesting story, and most of them are remarkably well written, while still having a ton of flexibility of being like, well, where do we go next? What do we want to do? Let me pick this plot point up and drop it somewhere else. Your group is in Horror at Headstone Hill, just into the session with the final conclusion of Jeremiah's I Own This Town speech. I gotta say, John, Horror at Headstone Hill might be my favorite plot point campaign. I need to run Terror on the Dark Frontier, but Horror at Headstone Hill is this perfect intersection of plot point narrative structure and complete open sandbox around Headstone Hill. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. So, things that we can learn from the narrative thing is, hey, maybe some of our adventure sites and our ideas in our sandbox should connect together into a larger narrative. sandbox style gives us the freedom to let the players explore whatever they want and see what story emerges. I tend to plot games in what I will call the multiple funnel way. I've run highly structured narrative games with 5-act structures. Here's where the campaign's, Act 1's going to start. Here's where Act 1 will end. Act 2, Act 3, all the way to the climax at the end of Act 4, and then a little denouncement in the 5th act. I have run completely randomly generated exploration and dungeon crawlers that both are games that kind of sit in my players' minds as great campaigns. But when I'm setting up a new campaign, after I've done my campaign prep, which we talked about before, and my setting prep, which we've talked about before, what I want to do is I want to create 10 to 15 story funnels, if you will. They are usually small, and I don't write more than, I take this from Palladium Games, I write a hook, line, and a sinker for each one of these little funnels. And basically what a hook, line, and sinker is, the hook is what gets the players interested. Once they're involved, what's really going on, and then what's the twist. L5R did these with their little challenge-focused strike adventure seeds. So the idea with each funnel is each funnel has a region of the campaign setting that it takes place in. It's got the major factions, and it's got a 3-point, hey, here's what's going to be happening. If the players either don't get involved, if players don't get involved in your adventure hooks, that's fine. Just advance them to the next most dangerous thing. And keep advancing these funnels until the players either get involved or the campaign world changes irrevocably. Players swooping in at the last second to save the day is kind of why we're playing heroic role-playing games. So the funnel has a geographic region. Call that the outside boundary of the funnel. And then I want 2 or 3 hooks that all kind of tie into what's going in that region. So typically I'll pick a faction or a big bad evil guy or lieutenant for the region. Then I give him, again, 3 lines of text. What's his goal? What's his plan? What happens if he succeeds? From that little center, I draw out to, hey, here are the 2 or 3 small adventures that will tie into that funnel. And then I prep, again, between 5 and 10 more of those, depending on the size of my campaign setting. Crucible doesn't have that many because it's a single city, whereas Axia is like 7 kingdoms pulled together. So there are too many funnels. And the idea with the funnel is it's going to start, you put your player's starting location in a place that kind of connects to all of the funnels. It has introduce 3 or 4 of the adventure hooks right off the bat, which your players choose. The idea is, as they are like the coin. If you guys have ever been to a mall, they have those gravity well kind of things where you drop the coin and they start spinning and circling and eventually fall down and your change is lost forever. That's what this idea is. It's that as players interact with each of the funnels, they're dropping their investment token there. And the more that they do in that circle, the more they're getting caught up in the web that's going on there. And the more they get caught up in the web, the fewer and fewer choices that they have as they're committing to this narrative. When they end that funnel, maybe they jump onto another one, maybe that's the end of the campaign. But the idea here is that you give the players 4 to 5 choices of what they want to do in the background. Now, if you're saying, but JM, I have this great big bad evil guy with this massive plot to take over the realms. Sweet. Each one of these funnels ends up being a lieutenant. Those lieutenants all drop into a larger funnel that leads to your big bad evil guy. This idea of multiple funnels that then can connect to other funnels that lead to a satisfying conclusion. That gives me the most flexibility as a GM, while giving the players the most agency, in my mind. it allows me to say I'm going to do a minimum amount of prep on 4 or 5 different full cool campaign ideas and wait to develop them as my players continue to invest. Yeah, a little like the lieutenant system in the Shadows of Mordor, where one guy leads you to a next guy, which leads you to the next guy, and sometimes they get replaced further down the line. But the idea here is I really think if you listen to the rhetoric online, there are 2 and only 2 options, and it's stories, like complex narratives, or sandbox. And the other side is completely wrong and morally irredeemable. I say this as somebody who streams on social media platforms. That kind of social media is the reason I don't want to engage. The truth is, most of our campaigns fit on a slider somewhere. I think, for me, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. I want a campaign setting that is open enough that players can go and do what they want, but as they take actions, those actions have consequences and start tying them in to the narrative threads that I've prepared beforehand. So again, 4 to 5 regional funnels, if you will. And each of those just require maybe 2 lines of text each. Who's the bad guy? What's their goal? What's their plan? What happens if they succeed? All right? From those 4 points, you come up with 2 or 3 starting adventures that kind of say, hey, if the players get involved with this, they will start heading in this direction. So let's take an example from Vendham. There is a warg king trying to invade the southern lands. Their goal is to establish a stronghold and a princedom south of the mountain range that kind of separates the 2 regions in Vendham. Their starting point for this is they need to gather enough money that they can give their bannermen the rewards they're going to need, or incentives to bind them to this ward king and send them south. So, in the local area, they have set up a small mine to mine for silver and gold and gems that they can then ship back north and eventually gather enough wealth to send an army south. That mine is my local adventure hook. It's a single adventure. It's a one-off that I wrote. But then I wanted to see how could I tie this idea of this mine connecting back up to one of the larger funnels. And so this mine acts as one of the ways to kind of get the group get involved in that story arc. I have in Vendham 15 factions that I've worked up, and I've got goals for each of them, and now I'm picking out the little individual starting adventures and scattering them across my starting area that the players can go out and engage with. For me, this is the way I've run games, I want to say, all my life. I lean towards one side or the other of the spectrum depending on the season of my life. But even my Hyperborea game, which wrapped up last night, the group decided not to explore the last 20 to 30 rooms of the Warlord's Palace and instead take their money and run, having completed their main objective, and decided to just, leave the Serpent Priests to whatever they were doing in, Underborea. That adventure was great. We got about 16 weeks of gaming out of it. It was $20. Totally well worth it. But it was this, hey, you're here to deal with this cult. Now go out into this little small sandbox and find your way to the cult with all these little subplots and adventures along the way. It's just the way it makes the most sense to me to run games. Again, I kind of blame Palladium Books for this because honestly, their hook, line, and sinkers are how I learned to plot adventures and to run as a GM. So my early game notes were literally just 6 lines: hook, plot, sinker, and I'm ready to go. So hopefully that has all been helpful to you. I don't know what's going on behind the screen next week. You will be as surprised as I am when I figure out what's going on next week. We've got Savage Universe tonight. Going to be talking to the guys at Star Anvil Studio about Secret World for Savage Worlds. Really excited about that. Got into the studio on Sunday of this last week, and we got the next 3 or 4 sessions of the Iconic Podcast recorded, and they're in the can, ready to go. Well, they're in the editing booth, I should say. They're not in the can yet. They're in the editing booth, and I'm working my way through them. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM. This has been Behind the Screen, and I will see you all later. Until next time, have a good one.